So first, just a little bit about my background. So I am the son of two immigrants who came to the United States. My father is from the Caribbean. My mother is Panamanian Chinese, meaning that she's ethnically full Chinese, but was born and raised in Panama. I also was born in Panama. However, I was conceived in Jamaica on a stormy night, I was told. I try to be precise when people tell me where I'm from. And so, having grown up, I grew up in New York City. I have two wonderful kids. I have a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter. And we lived in Asia for a number of years. And so me and my wife like to joke and say our kids were made in China, but assembled, distributed, and delivered in Taiwan. So we like to say globalization at its finest. So in terms of, just a little bit about myself, having grown up in New York City, one of the questions was asked, how has your faith impacted who you are today? And I love that question because for a large part of my life, I looked at the various cultures that defined who I am as kind of, who I am. And it wasn't until I heard a great sermon from the late Tim Keller, who I attended Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and I actually grew up with the Keller family. Tim's son and I went to college together at the College of William and Mary. And Tim gave us this great sermon about how we truly take our identity from Christ and that being part of who we are. And so that redefined how I thought about, how I explained, my core values of who I am. And, when I think of growing up in New York City and life there, one of the key topics I'd like to share about today is, as believers, how do we face conflict well? There's so many different types of conflict. There's internal conflict, there's external conflict, there is conflict, cyber conflict. There's a variety of different conflict that we have to deal with. And so I experienced conflict in a very real way when I was about 6 years old. I have no memories whatsoever of my parents holding hands, being affectionate. The only memories I have were the first memories I understood were conflict in my family, seeing my parents fight, argue. I remember one night I was 6 years old, and my dad and my mom were arguing. My mom slammed the door, locked the door. My dad walked through the door, broke the door, and walked through, and they kept arguing. And I'll never forget watching and seeing that, and seeing the tears just stroll down my face as my first understanding of conflict. A few months later, I remember my mom with me moving a bed from the 13th floor down to the 6th floor, and then not seeing my dad for the next few months because my dad left our family. And my mom, as a single mom, had to find a job, had to recalibrate our family. And we moved from we moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and me, my mom, and my sister slept on one bed. I'll never forget being ashamed of living in a 1-bedroom apartment and not wanting to bring friends over the house because we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. My mom, for a period of time, she used food stamps to buy milk and various other things. It was hard, at growing up in the city, but it was also a blessing as well, because my mom filled our house with so much love and so much, every Friday night we had what's called movie night. We watch a movie together. Saturday night we had game night. And it's interesting because so many of my friends, in many ways, would want to come over my house because there was so much joy and peace. And I was thankful that my mom, had to play the role of both a father and a mother when my dad left. But as I think about conflict and my first understandings of conflict, I think of one of my first clients. He was an amazing. He's Swiss German, and he took a chance on me. He was actually he gave me a scholarship when I was in college, and later on I was starting out in wealth management, and he became one of my first clients, and he's been a client for over 10 years, and he called me one day and he said, Earl, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. And as long as I've known him, he's never, ever said that to me. So I was kind of intrigued, and I said to him, tell me the bad news first. And he said, Earl, you've managed my assets for a number of years. I'm 76. And as I get older, I need to really simplify my finances. And so unfortunately, I'm going to have to close my account with you. And there's another, financial advisor that had been managing other aspects of this account. And so I was thinking about that, and I said to him, well, what's the good news? And he said, well, I said two things. I said, tell me the bad news first. And he said, he explained he had to close his account, but he said, Earl, we can grab lunch together and catch up. And I said, that's great. I said, and then I asked him, what's the good news? And he said, well, that was the good news, us getting together and having lunch. And I was like, oh yes, of course. That's great. That's wonderful good news. I'm so looking forward to that. But deep down inside, as I heard that news, that, and I should tell you, he's my biggest client that I've had for 10 years. The things that were going through the back of my mind was, how is that going to impact me, my family, and our financial, our family's finances? And so as I think about conflict, one of the greatest verses that I love and I rely on often is from Matthew, and I'll read the verse out. I can actually show the a picture here. So let me see if I can share my screen. But Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 26 says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, it puts them into practice, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the storms rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And so I love that verse because, throughout my life, I've experienced a lot of different challenges. I shared the story with my biggest client and what that meant to me. But this verse has always been part of my life because, when God believes in you and when you believe in God, God is with you. And we read a number of verses that talked about blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And that's so important because, when we think about the world that we live in today, there's almost this notion of an eye for an eye, this notion of like retribution. If someone wrongs you, we have the almost inherent desire to be able to get even. But many people forget the origins of an eye for an eye. And I think it's important to understand that if you look at the historical origins of an eye for an eye in the biblical Hebrew text, it was essentially a commandment found in the book of Exodus that was expressing the principle of reciprocal justice, kind of like a measure for measure. So the earliest known use of the principle appears in the code of Hammurabi, which predates the Hebrew Bible. But I just wanted to give you a little context that what that really means. So let's say Rich, I like Rich a lot. He's a good man. But let's say, for example, me and Rich have some kind of physical altercation. And, something happens. So instead of like me getting all of my friends to then go and, get back at Rich, an eye for an eye was historically designed to actually limit the amount of retribution that was given. So I think that's really important to understand the biblical text and understanding of what an eye for an eye stands for. When we talk about conflict, another story that is really inherent of how I have really thought of one of the best ways of how to deal with conflict is in the story of Joseph. And I love the story of Joseph because, here is someone who went from, the pinnacle of success to kind of like the pinnacle of, being in prison. And, you have someone who's essentially sold into slavery by his brothers, by his own siblings. But yet God uses those that example, and he uses that jealousy and that hatred for his own good. And so, as I think of, if we take a step back and what caused those conflicts, right? In the story of Joseph, it was one, jealousy. There was also misunderstanding, and there was also God's anointing, right? And what that means from his brothers and how God used that. And so if we think about the story of Joseph, and just to kind of like in a very brief way, after he gets promoted to this very amazing role, he then gets, the Potiphar's wife, sees him. She tries to, entice him. And as a result, he does not want to engage with her. He gets thrown into jail. But even in jail, the verse that consistently comes back is God is with him and God is faithful to him. And even in jail, he's put in charge of everything in jail. And as I think about, the way that God ultimately, redeems him, he does it in a way in which forgiveness and faithfulness in God's sovereign power, and also waiting patiently for him to restore relationships with his brother, is a great reminder of how God can engage us and allow us to be able to forge relationships with others in his own time, when he gives us the strength to be able to stay anchored with him, to be able to be able to overcome challenges. And I know many of us have in the heat of battle, in the heat of conflict, have said some things, have done some things that we probably wish we never did. But as I think about the ways in which we can honor God by being able to stay anchored in his love, he's able to help us by facing those challenges of conflict. So with that, as you think about conflict in your life today, who is God calling you to deal with conflict in your life? Is it a family member? Is it a friend? Is it a coworker at work? As you think about conflict in your own life, what is God telling you today on how to deal with that? Okay. Thank you.